Hello, hello, hello. We are back, and today in this hour we have Dave Burman from Wisconsin talking about how to model your hometown, how to model from your hometown to the mill. But first, before we mention that, I do want to mention our daylight shirts that have the NMRX logo on them, and our discount code is NMRX20. Take it away, David. Dave.
Well, good morning, all. It's a beautiful day here in Wisconsin. Sunny for a change. We've had a lot of rain lately. Literally, if you hear something rumbling in the background or hear a horn, it is not the Soundtracks decoder from my railroad. I literally can look out the window about a half block away and see the BNSF go by, and they chose to run a grain train for me literally 5 minutes ago. So kind of an appropriate start for today. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about going from the hometown elevator to the mill. If you caught the first one of these I did, and it's available online, I talked a little bit about getting from the farm to the smaller hometown elevators. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about getting that from the elevator into rail cars, moving the rail cars to a larger facility where the grain may be processed or stored or shipped. And then part 3 is talking about some of that processing. So you get to hear me for at least another one, I hope, if you guys aren't getting tired of me. I'm gonna go ahead and start my PowerPoint. And we'll go to the application window. And we'll share that. And I'll start the PowerPoint so we can get that up. And hopefully you can see it okay. The reason I talk about hometown to mill is because that's probably a lot of what we model. A lot of these mills get bigger, and they would be a model railroad unto themselves. If you've ever built the Walthers ethanol plant, it could be a 4x8 model sheet of model railroad without even blinking. And you could have enough car movements there to have a pretty healthy operating session for a couple of people. But chances are pretty good we're thinking about that local train that goes out there and peddles cars to industries and picks them up. Very similar to the Rock Island train that you see on the opening slide here. We'll talk a little bit about that train coming up. But then we go from that little hometown local to the mill, and not far up the river from me, the Mississippi, for those of you who may be geographically challenged, is the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis and St. Paul used to be known as the grain milling capital of the world, and this is a picture straight out of there. And this was actually on the riverfront mills. And if you've ever been to the Twin Cities and you've gone to the Mill City Museum, you can kind of see some of that structure in the back. Now, I'm guessing other than where the Mill City Museum building is, most of this is parking lots for the new football stadium, and has long ago been taken out. Kind of interesting, I wanted to go back deep and see how far back I could get images out of the Minnesota Historical Society, and when I found this image, I put it up for some of my local guys, and they ask a bunch of questions, including the fact that the front of this locomotive doesn't have a coupler. It does. It's a Lincoln pin. That tells you how old this image might be. But it still has some of the railroads we're familiar with, the Great Northern stock car, which has been wood sheathed, so I suspect they're using it to haul grain, and the Northwestern boxcar with a grain door. So it goes back to talking a little bit about how some of the things that we're looking at go. Well, first you have to have a car, and I like to highlight the Midwest railroads where I grew up. I did grow up through the late transition period. I remember GP9s. I grew up in Iowa along the IC, so I'm very familiar with black GP9s, and 4 of them hauling strings and strings of 40-foot boxcars out to the elevators, or flying by with meat in reefers, because that's what I grew up with. So I'm kind of familiar with that particular period of time. I model modern. And so as I was listening to Miles and John's presentation, I'm thinking about signage and some of the things that I go with. But I wanted to throw this Chicago Great Western. Very typical 40-foot boxcar of the 40s. This one actually has a relay stencil of 1938, and this is from Omaha, Nebraska. We haven't figured out exactly which elevator this is in Omaha yet, And I suspect it's a 4x5 negative that was just contact printed when I found the picture. But obviously it has to have a card. In the era that most of us model, it's probably going to be some sort of either 40-foot boxcar or covered hopper. So we're going to talk about those. Straight off of the Santa Fe down in Kansas, this is a fairly notable historical picture. Arthur Rothstein, if you're a photo connoisseur, probably maybe even from the WPA era of some of those images. This one appears a lot. You can find it in a lot of books. But again, it was all about the local peddling cars to the local elevators. Now, there are a number of elevators in this picture. There may have been different companies buying grain in every town. Every little town may have had several different companies competing for the grain. As the eras went, some of that contracted. They went to bigger facilities and they consolidated. I throw this one in because this is my quiz for the day. This is a 40-foot boxcar awaiting loading at a grain facility. And if you could barely make out the reporting marks and the patch out, yes, they did patch cars out back in the 50s and 60s. You'll notice that the reporting marks are LS and BC, LaSalle and Bureau County. At the end, if I remember, I'm going to ask you what is significant about the LaSalle and Bureau County and painted out boxcars, for those of you who may know. But it's still, even in the modern day, it's still that local peddler out there and a conductor that has to get off, or a brakeman that has to get off and go in and push those covered hoppers in and make the cut. It may be an older metal wood sheathed elevator with spouts. It may be a fast loading flood loader with 110 covered hoppers. You still have to have a car to do it. And that car has to be prepared. I'm trying to get a little bit more information about this picture because I don't have a lot of good data on it. DL&W, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western car. The one directly behind it is a New York, New Haven, and Hartford. You can tell, the only reason I could tell that was the big script letter logo. So I suspect this one might be around the Buffalo area, which was a huge flour milling area. They got a lot of grain. So I think that might be where that gone. You notice the gentleman is climbing up, and he's climbing up on the wooden grain door, which is how we made boxcars load grain comfortably. And he's got a big rod. That big rod is for pulling grain from a variety of places inside the boxcar. And generally just getting in there and going down and pulling. You'll see the little bags on the bottom of the door. I'm sure his partner hands those up to him, and he is just taking samples of grain. Grain is graded. And it's inspected for the amount of dirt, the amount of foreign material, the amount of foreign grain in it, because that determines how much value they can assign to the grain and how much they can pay. Grain was paid for shipping by weight, but it was bought by quality. You also notice the crowbar hanging on the boxcar door, probably used to get it open. We'll show you some modern methods of getting boxcar doors open in a minute. When we talk about cooperage, obviously, cooperage deals with getting that grain door in. Early on, the grain doors were wood, and most of the boxcars were lined with wood. And one of the things I'd seen in a number of 40-foot boxcars, one of the things I was lucky to be able to, I lived very, very near to the Chicago Northwestern facilities in Olwine, Iowa. And anytime that they were going to scrap something, it probably got stored at Olwine before it went to the great razor blade factory in the sky. And so we could walk down lines of these boxcars. And because my brother was interested in modeling the Great Western, and I was just interested in going along because it was railroad and rail fanning, we would actually go, and we did this with the bay window cabooses they had. We did it with the boxcars, but I'd see these load lines in them, and I always wondered what that was about. And so when I presented this for my local group, I found out that they still ship and pay the tariffs by weight, but these were kind of guide marks, if you will, to make sure that you would have enough grain in the car, but not overload it, to not overload the weight that the car could take, and obviously have to be reloaded or load shifted or a variety of things. We don't model that much, but if you're an operator, that's the kind of thing that if you would get an overweight car, you might have to set it out and they may have to do something with it. You could move this in via alternate waybills in your car card system. Your JMRI system may throw a car occasionally out that was overweight that you might have to do those kinds of things. So if you're an operator, there's some options for these. Well, we got to get it loaded. Well, before there were grain elevators and the ability to get it above the car, chances are pretty good it was directly to the car. And the interesting part of this is I've seen this a number of places. I'd seen these ramps, and a lot of these cuts were near places that had dirt cuts, or they had actually made dirt cuts, and they were actually loading the grain directly in the boxcars. I can't imagine that this was anything more than a hot and dirty process. You'll notice the gentleman has a shovel. My guess is that's to get it totally out of the truck, but I'll wager you dollars to donuts there's somebody inside this boxcar making sure that grain gets moved to it even so they can get as much grain in the car as they can. And I saw this a couple of ways. It happened all year round. I'll bet this one was a little bit cold, seeing that we have snow. Anyone who knows the Midwest knows any place there is a rail line in a cut and we have a blizzard, it fills up with snow. So my guess is these had to be dug out and plowed. I love this 40-foot Milwaukee boxcar, wooden sheathed, outside braced car. I don't know the truck. I'm going to say maybe a Mac or a Model A. I don't know for sure. But again, just a little bit better picture of that loading. Well, obviously, this was one truck at a time, and it probably wasn't all that efficient. It might take them a couple of days to get enough trucks to load a boxcar. Well, obviously, that had to come from your local farm. We didn't have the elevators at that time. So as we started to build more storage, we had to find a little bit more efficient way of getting it into the cars. Still 40-foot boxcars. We still have grain doors. Well, we said, well, maybe if we don't have an elevator yet, we can build something. And they built conveyors, a variety of different kinds. This one is a cockshut. This is out of Canada, strangely enough, the Canadian Thresherman and Farmer from August 1919. And I love this because I see the Northern Pacific boxcar in Canada. So they did have some lines that extended into Canada, so it isn't completely. But my guess is they were looking at the American wheat market when they were putting this out. And actually, we have a picture of what that looks like for real into a Canadian Pacific boxcar. Again, grain door, higher grain door, so probably lighter weight grain, less dense, maybe barley possibly. Hard to say. But again, this is going back, if you're modeling in the 1900s, you may not have a tractor, you may have a team of horses, your team track, if you will, and a wagon. And this wouldn't be impossible to scratch build out of styrene or even strip wood if you wanted to get to that point. I'm surprised somebody hasn't 3D printed one at this point. I know they've 3D printed conveyors for the modern era because I've picked a couple of those up. Well, there's your typical boxcar. UP, this one's out in Nebraska. Typical elevator, has a grain door. This one's been coopered. It's a wooden door. This one was probably plywood or at least 1x4s. And these didn't last long for a couple of reasons. Number one of the ways they unloaded them was to basically break them in. The other thing is, I suspect nice lumber out in the prairies was at a premium, and I'll wager people may have built their garage or their roof or a shed with some of these when they could scrap them. There's a fairly interesting story about a Chicago Northwestern conductor selling grain doors out of the cars that should have been used in the cars for grain that I've read recently. But obviously wood was at a premium, and we discovered that we could use corrugated paper. And what this would be laminated sections of basically corrugated cardboard like you get in any box, or fairly thick craft paper, and then they would reinforce it with something. In this case, it's probably smaller, just strip type wood, maybe 1x2s, 1x4s. Used to see a lot of these around, and as they would unload them, the lading would sometimes remain in the car. A lot of times the grain doors would live in the car and they'd have to be cleaned out before they were used for something else. Citing near where I went to school, one of the things that they loaded there was corrugated paper to make grain doors, and there were always piles of these grain doors floating around waiting to be disposed of. But eventually they figured out there's another way to do this and a lot easier. They made what was called the Signode grain door. Signode makes metal strips, and they do a lot of metal construction. And their metal strips was basically a nailing strip with this paper laminated to both sides, and you could go into one of these cars and nail a Signode door in pretty quickly. They just roll them out, hammer, 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 and they were ready to load. Obviously, the faster we can load a car, the less demurrage that we have to pay for, and the more cars we can ship. 40-foot boxcars during harvest season become a premium because elevator owners want to get grain out of their elevators so they can store the new crop. And obviously, farmers want to have their grain shipped at a time when people are buying at a good price. Oftentimes in the Midwest, particularly in Iowa, along some of these smaller county roads that you would find along the rail line, because the rail lines followed the roads in a lot of cases. Funny how that works. You would find lines of boxcars stored ready to go. You don't see that much anymore unless there's a downturn in the economy, but you would always find elevators that were hoarding cars. And the Chicago Northwestern, this is a very, very typical boxcar. I love the weathering patterns on this. If you're into weathering, just going to look at 40-foot grain boxcars, you'll see some pretty interesting cars, because these were probably getting close to end-of-life cars, because they'd ship lumber in them, and then as they got beat up or something, they would gradually go down in service, and eventually by the end they might have been hauling salt or hides or something, the last possible thing before they went to the, like I say, the great Toyota factory in the sky, or the razor blade factory. Here's another look at some of those grain doors. This one's a International Stanley door, Omni paper. They're all pretty much the same. The nice thing about these is when you're at the site, it's just a knife and you're unloading grain. And we can model that. The wooden ones are from an HO manufacturer. They're very similar to some of the ones that I have seen from laser cut from Jaeger Products. If you search HO grain doors, you'll find a couple of sources for these. The cardboard ones I put in O-scale from Keel Line, but Jaeger also makes the Signode grain doors, I know for a fact. So you could actually put these in the cars. When we get done, I'll show you one of the cars that I put some of these nice laser cut doors in, and they look pretty good. But then it's just getting it into the car. And in a boxcar situation, it was probably just a spout with a tube. I have seen these tubes made out of rubber tubing. I've seen them made out of a corrugated product that they could just stick in the grain door and just shoot the grain where they wanted to. And obviously, when you have a little bit of pneumatic behind you and the gravity, it moves pretty quick. It's not quite as fast as flood loading, but you can still get it in there quite a bit. This is from a Canadian grain elevator site. The one cool thing about Canada, in the United States, I'm not exactly sure why, but a lot of times wooden grain elevators, there's still quite a few of them around, but they went down pretty quick to be replaced by concrete. In Canada, there's still a lot of these Prairie Sentinels around. And if you search Prairie Sentinels or Canadian grain elevator, there are all kinds of detail pictures if you need something. So this one has multiple spouts and probably has the ability to not only shoot to the boxcar, but this one's kind of a mixed use facility. It has a covered hopper. They may actually have a modern elevator that they load top, but in this case, they're still loading. And you'll notice the gentleman is closing the boxcar door with the assistance of a tractor with a loader on it. One of the things that you discover with 40-foot boxcars is A, they rust, which means that the rollers on the door get real sticky. And because there's grain in them, there's always crudted grain. So they always need some sort of assist in getting that car to get the door shut, because they don't want rain to get in on that grain. That obviously would spoil some of it. So they're going to ship these even with the grain doors, with the doors closed. I have seen doors open. I remember seeing doors open. I wasn't very old at the time, but I do remember seeing doors that have slid back open. And yeah, there were some cases, but most of the time they were shipped doors closed. I throw this one in because one of the things that, if you're a grain guy, you drive an awful lot of what I call blue highways. I used to tell my wife, if you're planning on getting anywhere fast with me, it doesn't always happen unless you tell me we got to be someplace. We'll hit the interstate. But if we have a little bit of time, I'm going to back road it. And so I love Nebraska. I've seen places in Nebraska that aren't places, but I've seen some really interesting stuff. This is a little elevator between Webster City and Duncombe, Iowa. And I throw this in because this was the last picture taken of this before they did this. One of the things that volunteer fire departments love to do is train, because they never get a chance to actually fight a big fire until they have to do one. So they like to train. And obviously the elevator early on didn't need this facility. And they said, well, maybe we can do something with this. And it would cost them a lot to tear this down. These things are built like forts. They use heavy lumber, but they burn really well. And once they're burned, they're a lot easier to pick up with a payloader. You don't need a backhoe or a screen. So in this case, last Saturday, they did a test burn on this, and they did manage to get it to the ground. The spouts are spaced pretty comfortably for 40-foot boxcars. At one time, there was a team track into this where they would load. There was also probably a load for a trailer in there. Again, the more options they have for loading, the better. Off to the right-hand side, you see the grain dryer. They were protecting that, putting a water stream on it to make sure that it didn't catch fire, because that's worth something to them. And a lot of these old elevators still exist. These were shot back. These are actually grain mill facilities, feed mill facilities, and those spouts still exist, and these elevators still exist. These were shot back in 2018 along the UP down in southern Iowa, or central Iowa. But most of the time they were adapted over time from the chute to the boxcar to top loading, because obviously we needed bigger product. We needed to be able to ship more of it. And this is an elevator down in Kansas on what was the old Rock Island. Based on the dirt and the track and the grass, I'm guessing they don't ship much grain out of here, if at all. But it was an interesting shot to put in. Well, getting back to our Rock Island local. This is the Winterset local. It ran out of Des Moines and went over to Winterset, Iowa, and ran a little bit further. And its main job was going out and servicing small town agricultural industries, because that's what Iowa has. There's probably a lumber yard there. They may ship lumber in. There's a fuel dealer. There are all kinds of feed and grain type product dealers. In this case, somewhere along the way, I suspect there was a flour mill, because the lead covered hopper is an air slide. So either there's a user that wanted flour or some sort of powdered grain. And so this one's a little bit odd, but as is typical, you can see that the trackage here is not in great shape. The Rock Island was one of those that was almost always in financial peril, if you will. I don't want to say trouble, but peril, because they were always trying to upgrade, but they weren't making a lot of money. They had a lot of competitors. A lot of people were shipping along some of these similar avenues just 10 miles over. You could take it over to the Northwestern and they may be able to get you a better rate to move it. It was really precarious. And one of the problems is the trackage wasn't well maintained and it was really light. And so they would actually sometimes derail just sitting on the rail. And that's what's going on here. The reason I show you this shot is because you'll notice that there's a 2-bay grain American Car and Foundry, ACF, probably a 2700. Smaller 2-bay covered hopper. The Rock Island, in order to have that top loading and some of that fast unloading, they still put a lot of boxcars into elevators, but they ordered a ton of 2-bay hoppers, not for moving cement or sand, the things you normally would see in shorter covered hoppers, but grain, because they would be a little bit lighter to get across the tracks. And we saw this a lot. And here's a shot of those smaller covered hoppers. Here, the local is waiting for a road freight going by. And you see the elevator in the background. But as we got bigger and the elevators got bigger, we had to be able to load those covered hoppers faster. And we did more with flood loading. In this case, you're seeing a large elevator. All of that stuff dumps to the bottom where an elevator takes it up to a flood loading device. In this case, you'll see that there are a couple of loading chutes so they can load both sides. But this item right here takes care of a lot of the dust, keeps the dust down. It also allows them to have a large amount of grain going into that car. So if they do get an interruption, they can continue to load. Same elevator had 2 facilities. It's not an uncommon thing. You'll notice that in modern days, you're probably going to get to model some fall suppression in there. Because now if you get up on anything OSHA, anything higher than a 6-foot ladder, OSHA says you will be tied in. And they actually will show you some shots in coming up of some people dumping some cars where they are actually in tied. The other thing is you don't want to fall in one of these covered hoppers because grain will suck you down into it. But this is a pretty normal small town operation. They have an elevator here, but in this case, they're loading the covered hoppers directly from a bottom dump truck. Probably came off of a farm or an elevator that does not have rail loading currently. And this is nothing more than a flood loading facility. This is a Walthers kit. It's 2 of them. You need the elevator part that goes up, and you need the wet dry bins, which put it into the cars, a little bit of kit bashing, and you are there. I'm playing with one of these right now. I don't have it. I just have the elevator built. I've been cussing a little bit at the wet dry bin, but I hope to have one of these for the next one to show. But now it's pretty much flood loading. And you notice these gentlemen, they all have that nice little harness on. So if they fall in, they've got a cable that's going to hold them out of the grain, and somebody will come to their rescue. They may have to yell a little bit, but it's done a lot faster. Today, we load 110-car covered hopper grain trains. They're expected to be loaded within 48 hours of the time they are dropped. The railroad says if we can't pick it up in 48 hours, put our locomotives on it, and haul it, we will charge you demurrage above and beyond what we did to get it there. So obviously, when you hear the word earthworm in the BN world, it's 110 brown covered hoppers. It's a little bit stranger to model. It's maybe not as cool as the 40-foot boxcars, but it's what I modeled, and I get to play a lot with some weathering. This is out of UP elevator. These are UP cars, CHTTs. I think that's a Trinity. It might be one of the Gundersons. Scale Trains, Athearn make these cars. Walthers just made a really, really nice NSC car that fits this build nicely. Again, it looks just like a big styrene sheet. This is a little bit different. This is in an ethanol plant, and this is byproduct from ethanol. This is dried distiller's grain. And dried distiller's grain is basically a little bit lighter. It's a little more powdered. It can go down a little bit different chute. And this one is just a piece of extendable plastic that they just lower and raise up into the ceiling. I've been looking at these and I'm thinking, gee, you know those nice little flexi straws that you get in some of these places? I'm looking at that flexi part and going, can I use this? Can I use this here? And some of our nicer covered hoppers now have open hatches. So I'm going to try an open load in a loading bay. I'm going to see if that, and obviously somebody I'm sure makes a nice white metal casting of a grain scoop. And then obviously conveyors. I suspect this isn't grain by the fact that what's going in looks very looks very mineral-like, but this is very similar to what the conveyor would be. Walthers has one of these in one of their kits. There are some gorgeous ones on Shapeways that you can build you can get out of 3D. They're a little bit pricey, but if you're looking for that hopper, and these are basically 3-bay cylindricals or 4-bay cylindricals, probably loading soda ash or some sort of nutrient, or not nutrient, but fertilizer or mineral component at this site. I'm looking at that ground. It does not look like it's susceptible for growing much, but I could be wrong. And then there's always somebody who gets creative with the loading. I saw this and I had to throw it in. I suspect this is for truck loading, particularly for feed trucks. But man, if you can repurpose anything, these guys will do it. This is a Santa Fe 4-bay, similar probably to the Athearn car, and it's got all kinds of gingerbread. You'll notice that the elevators have tubes that run over to it so you can load to it. It has all kinds of interesting loading structure. It's got some concrete block. Hey, Pike stuff, here we come. You figure out how to do this, and you'll put that up, and somebody will say, they never did that. Well, I got a picture. So pretty much anything that's out there. I have seen a ton of covered hoppers repurposed for this. And I've even seen them used as flood loading for other covered hoppers in places. It's kind of one of those, if we can figure out how to do it, we'll figure out a way to make it work. This is a feed mill, incidentally. Neutrina Feeds, talking about the signage. Feed mills and elevators love signage. And a lot of those logos are available out there online in the public domain. If you know the company you're going to want to put on your elevator, look for Co-op. You can find the double circle. Neutrina Feeds is a Cargill product. Excuse me. Probably out there too. I have found Cenex Harvest States and old Cenex logos back into the Felco days. MFA, Missouri Farmers Association, they have a really, really nice shield. You can find those logos. So all of these things can be gotten, and they print really nicely on an inkjet printer out of something as simple as PowerPoint. If you're a little bit more elaborate and you have Photoshop elements, you can do a lot with these. Well, our Rock Island local is making its way back to the yard and probably on to greater destinations, probably taking those cars that have filled up with grain to an end user. Might be a mill, might be a bigger elevator, depending. We don't know. If we're operators, we do, because we probably have a set of car cards with waybills in them, and we know where those cars are destined to go. We may have picked up a switch list along the way that can tell us any of that stuff that we can find from our railroads helps us model. I have friends in the railroad industry that will send me their waste paper baskets of switch lists, because occasionally I'll glean something out of there. I'll find some piece that's really interesting that allows me to say, okay, maybe I can find something from this that can help me model a little bit. It may be going to a small town feed mill. Those of you who have done business with Spring Creek model trains know they live in Deschler, Nebraska. Deschler, Nebraska is a town of about 700 people. It sits in the middle of the grain belt as hard as it can go. They do not have a grain elevator. They have feed mills, and a couple of them actually. This is one of the feed mills, and I was down there for an open house they were doing, and I saw this building and I said, man, this thing just looks like it belongs on a model railroad. It has a lot of different things. It has the metal kind of grain bins that we can get from a variety of sources. It has the wooden flour mill type building, which we could scratch build. There's also American Model Builders does some very similar buildings to this, Silex elevator, some things that you could kit bash fairly easily. I love the brick tile bin. And then it has a modern Friesen bin. And if you remember the last one, I talked about the toy tractor folks in 164th. They have this bin, and it's not a long way out of scale for HO. It actually looks pretty good. I've built a couple of them, and I'm using them for a little bit larger facility. But it has the conveyors. This would fit so nicely on a branch line layout, on a shelf layout. It would be perfect. Another one. This is very typically Purina Chow's. Talking about those signs. Purina was checkerboard, Ralston Purina checkerboard, and they used that logo everywhere. I've seen it on covered hoppers. I've seen it on trucks. I've seen it on buildings. This is a perfect example of that. All that gingerbread coming off of that elevator tower, all that dust facility, all that dust collection stuff. This is a metal pike stuff building, glorified, but it's got a lot of stuff added to it that if you wanted to spend a little bit of time, you could do something. And these guys would get a car of grain, particularly grain that they didn't grow locally. Maybe they needed wheat and they were in the corn belt, or they wanted oats and they don't grow it enough of it locally to feed whatever horses, I think, are big oats feeders. I don't know exactly. I can't remember all the things that eat oats, but there are quite a few of them. Again, that's the kind of product that you might find in there. And there's all kinds of components to go into feed. Everything from tank cars and molasses and different liquids to all kinds of different minerals and bone meal and blood meal. There's a lot of things that you could model into a facility just like this one. And it's not big. But like everything in the modern era, they get big. This is a feed mill in western Iowa in an area that feeds a lot of hogs. And this is basically providing feed. They have their own grain elevator. This is in a complex that has 6 different concrete elevators, not a whole lot smaller than the one in the background, plus the milling plant that sits in front. And then they have their feed store where they would bag it up, or they would sell you the amount that you can put on whatever truck you drove in there on, right up front. And the railroad is there. And there's a spur that goes back to all this that they have the covered hoppers and some of the things on. Well, it may go into storage because small town elevators can't store everybody's grain. So they need to have someplace to ship it, to store it. End users need to have someplace to store it until they're ready for it. This is the Viterra elevator in Minneapolis. This is just south and a little bit west, like 100 yards west of Northtown Yard in Minneapolis. And it is a concrete structure. There used to be 3 or 4 other structures very similar to this in this area. There was a steel elevator along the main lines that just recently was torn down. I have some pictures of it. Again, this is a territory that I'm modeling. The reason I love this is Minnesota. It's being switched by the Canadian Pacific, and the cars that are going in there are Canadian grain. Chances are pretty good, maybe barley. One of the things that Minneapolis has become since they've lost their title of a grain miller to the world is small brewer to the world. There are 1 million craft brewers in Minneapolis that create all kinds of different product, and they ship a lot of product out of these elevators. This thing looks like it's death warmed over, like it's ready to be abandoned, but every time I go there, it seems to have cars. This is the Union Equity elevator. It probably has changed hands since this picture was taken in Saginaw, Texas. This one and another one fight for the title of the biggest grain elevators out there. I'm not going to get into that battle because I think if it isn't this one, the next one is the one. This is in Lawrence, Kansas. This thing is easily 1 mile to 1.5 miles, maybe 2. I never actually drove along it to find out long. This is a storage elevator primarily for wheat. And there's a lot of pieces on this particular elevator. They'll actually give you a virtual tour of it. There are a lot of pictures. So if you hunt and search for this, there's a lot of information on this elevator. This thing is huge, to say the least. And I can't imagine anybody modeling all of it, but compressed, this thing would eat cars like mad. And this dated back into the 40-foot boxcar era. But chances are pretty good it's going to someone who's going to actually process that grain. This is a small mill in Hutchinson, Minnesota, probably long gone. They made flour, and they shipped flour. They got grain in, they shipped bags of flour out. One of the things I've learned about the flour industry is when they ship flour, they like to ship it in insulated boxcars or, in this era, older reefers. Why? Because they were clean and they were tight. You wouldn't get a lot of vermin damage. You wouldn't get a lot of dirt damage in the bags. So they love those things. So you would always see, and you'd see a lot of reefers shipped to given to mills. And one of the railroads that we operate up here on River Rail in the La Crosse area, Steve Brudlos models an absolutely gorgeous Milwaukee road line, has the Lake City mill, and he gets Milwaukee older insulated reefers. That is in the bag line. The grain comes in boxcars, but the bag line goes out a lot of times in those insulated cars or the reefers. So that's one of those little hooks you can throw in if you have a flour mill. They've gotten bigger too. This is Lake States Milling in Winona, Minnesota. This is from the riverside. The rail side is actually on the other side. We have plans of this mill if anybody's interested, and a lot of good interior pictures if you're even remotely intrigued in modeling something this big. There's some really nice signs on the other side. I haven't been able to get back up there. I work in Winona, and I've been COVIDed out of the facility. So I'm working from home, so I haven't been up there to take any more pictures recently. This is on the railroad I model. This is right next to Northtown Yard. This is the General Mills facility in Fridley, Minnesota. And you may have noticed the last time I held up a box of Cheerios. If you eat Cheerios or Lucky Charms, the flour that makes your cereal, not the marshmallows and Lucky Charms, but the flour that makes your cereal comes from this facility. They used to use this facility entirely for grain cleaning, and then they would ship it about 5 miles railroad south to a place called Purity Oats, which General Mills also owned, where they would mill it. Now they have added to this facility, and it's all done locally in this facility because the Purity Oats site is highly coveted as housing for downtown. So obviously, if they could get the money to do the construction from selling it, they would do that. So now there's a lot more buildings, there's a lot more elevator structure in here than when this picture was taken. But this thing eats cars. It not only gets grain cars coming in, it gets the pressure differential cars that BLMA made, that Atlas has made in a variety of forms to ship the flour out. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. This is the ADM Corn Sweeteners facility in Clinton, Iowa. They make corn syrup. If you drink Coke, if you've had a Budweiser product recently, chances are pretty good you may have seen some, or Miller product, you may have seen something that had some corn syrup added to it. Not to sweeten it all the time. Obviously, Coke, Diet Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, and your Diet Dr. Pepper probably has a little bit of corn sweetener in it. Diet, maybe aspartame, not as much. But they use corn syrup as a starter to enrich the alcohol production process in beer brewing. So you didn't know why those tank cars were sitting there at the old style brewery, now City Brewery here in La Crosse, but that's why they were there. And this is one of the places that produces a lot of that. They also produce starch, a variety of things. This facility is so large it can produce any number of things. It also has a river shipping component. Ethanol and biodiesel. This thing reeks Walther's ethanol plant. Obviously, you can see the buildings that they have, the inner process starting area, the stills, that concrete elevator for storing the incoming grain. There's probably a facility that allows you to do the spent grains. You've got tank facilities, you've got the cooling. Pretty much every kit that's available out there, you have available to you, and this would fit in a manageable space. It's pretty big. I got to say that. It takes up a lot of space, but it's a pretty cool kit if you want to do something a little bit more modern. Might go to a river port. May go on the water. In my world, it goes down the Mississippi River, but the Ohio, the Missouri, the Columbia are all navigable, and it probably gets on a barge or a larger ship. larger ship. Again, this is Portland, where they're loading covered hoppers into this grain freighter to go. But once it's there, we got to get it out of the car. In this case, we got to get it out of the elevator, and that's just a shot of one of those corrugated tubes. I wonder how much of the grain he has left when he gets home. But, well, in the old days, it had to be shoveled out, and they had what was called a Dutch shovel. And these were essentially boards that they would climb into the car, shove down in the grain, and then pull out with a cable. And it would be just like a big bulldozer ram. There's a law of diminishing returns. They couldn't be totally big. You couldn't go across the whole car and push it all out. You'd break the cable. And if you know anything about the way cables break, if you're in front of it, it's a very painful, maybe a fatal process. So they would do it gradually over time. Another shot of that. And this is a little bit bigger process. It was just shoveled out, and they literally had hatches beside where the cars came in. And it just shoveled into a pit, and it was taken up into the elevators. This one can also load cars. You'll notice that corrugated loading structure. So they could literally get a car out and potentially load it in the same facility. Well, we needed a faster way to do that. So what about rocking the car? Modern guys know about this. We flip coal hoppers all the time, but this dates back into the 50s, where they would actually lock the car down and they would rock it back and forth and tip it back and forth on a pedestal. And as you can see, it you'll notice the locking mechanism for the coupler. This thing looks like it might have been an NMRA tour at one time. You'll notice over to the side where the pneumatic tubing is, there's kind of a hydraulic structure. That's the thing that pushes the grain door out. And they would just push that out and recover it if they could. Otherwise, it would be sorted out as it got down into the bin. And then they'd have to do a full clean out. And this is the first time I'd ever seen anybody vacuuming out a car. I suspect this car might have gotten some flour loading or something else. It also has a very interesting perforated floor. So there may be more to this picture than I know. Well, today it's the same thing. If we got to get it out, we're still sampling. It's a little bit different process. These guys are bad. They're not wearing their fall protection gear. The USDA also inspects. They have their own car with inspection materials, equipment for testing scales. The only reason I throw this in is this car went past us Tuesday night going east on the BN, which means it could be going anywhere. This is kind of an interesting car. Maybe somebody wants to model this. It's kind of a combination grain trailer, box car. I'm sure somebody sees those bars and wonders if it isn't some sort of prison vehicle. But today, it all flood loads down. Basically, they open it up and it goes down into grates. These grates are very modelable. Again, the 1/64th guys have a lot of this stuff that we could adapt to HO. Walthers has some in some of their kits. But we kind of have to play a little bit with how we would do that. But as covered hopper manufacturers get creative and they get more requests, now it's one big trough. It comes in a big trough at the top and it dumps in a trough at the bottom. This is a brand new Gunderson car. I've seen exactly 2 of these in the real world. I understand there's some out there in my neighborhood. I'm going to have to do a little bit of exploring. But those kinds of dumps are really available. This is a 3D product by Mike Brusky, Dimensional Modeling Concepts. Again, put your rails on it, you're there. Flour gets unloaded pneumatically from those pressure aid cars. Basically, they open it up and they vacuum it out. Or they put air in the car to fluidize it and then vacuum it out. Same kind of thing. They unload plastic pellets the exact same way. And if you model the ethanol process and you do dry distiller's grains to a feed facility, if you know anything about distiller's grains, if they stay in a car too long, they get hard. This is what they call a load breaker. This is nothing more than a low-end backhoe with a rod they can use to break up the grain inside of the car. And they use this to literally go into the loads and punch them out. I have seen this stuff hard as concrete where they were literally chipping it out with a jackhammer if it stayed in the car too long. Wet distiller's grains have to be unloaded very quickly or they will, in fact, turn to concrete. So I've given you part 2. Part 3 is the next phase of this. We're going to talk a lot about those bigger mills. Not quite as modelable, but still pretty cool in a lot of cases. In this case, this is the Staley corn syrup mill down in southern Illinois, I believe Champaign or Carbondale. There's a lot of good data on mills right now. If you're looking, we're going to talk a little bit about the milling process for flour and some of the products that are produced and some of the ways rail interfaces with that. We'll talk about the process for using corn for syrup, for oil, for starches, those kinds of things, and some of that milling. We'll talk about the ethanol process. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the milling processes and how they end up coming to us. So that's pretty much where I end up. And so if we have some questions.
We do. We have one from Thomas Gager. He was asking, did they ship the grain doors on the boxcar when they were being, I'm going to guess, talking about being returned empty?
A lot of times they get returned empty, and it's really interesting that in a lot of cases, grain doors were a locally sourced product. The elevators would actually make them. Early on, the railroads provided them, but the railroads wanted out of that business because the grain door is a fairly pricey thing. So you would actually have coopering groups that would work with an elevator. Sometimes it was the small town elevator or small town lumber yard that would work. A lot of the elevators were cooperatives that had the lumber yard and the hardware store. They'd have the fuel consignment. They'd have basically a fuel jobber in town. They'd handle fertilizer. Co-ops were big, and so if they could do it, they would do it as much as they could. The railroads didn't like to be in the grain door business.
All right. Somebody was talking about there's lateral scratches that are going left. That are the lateral scratches or gouges marked to the right of boxcar doors were sometimes due to the assistance of closing doors with forklifts or maybe a tractor, as we saw here.
When I presented this for some of my local operating group, I've got a lot of older rails in that, and they said they have been known to see people pushing boxcar doors and have them fall off of the rail.
Oh wow!
And they said, well, that's kind of an interesting thing if you're under it. I'm sure not as interesting as you might think.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there was a lot of peril in the older grain hauling. There's still some of it today, but it isn't quite as perilous.
So, we did have your question, your trivia question of the day.
Okay, the trivia question. LaSalle and Bureau County had a number of boxcars that were remarked. Anybody know why?
And we actually have somebody who's already responded.
Okay.
And that was Bruce Wilson.
Yeah.
And he said they were boxcar thieves.
Boxcar thieves, yes, the LaSalle and Bureau County. In the days where railroads were in financial peril, they would sometimes lose track of cars for months/years at a time. The LaSalle and Bureau County was a very, very tiny railroad down in Illinois, and when they needed grain cars, they would ask for grain cars, and they'd sometimes get grain cars, and they would lose them. But they wouldn't actually lose them in their system. They'd change the reporting marks, and they would actually do that. They took a number of New York Central cars. They took a number of Rock Island cars. The car you saw was a New York Central car. And they literally would use those. The nice thing with their reporting marks on them, they get the demurrage for the car. So rather than just getting the loading dollars, they get the money for the time that car was out on the railroad. This was before ACI labels. This was before AEI tags. The only way you knew who the car was a clerk walking that car line and saying this is an LS LaSalle and Bureau County. And there were tons of clerks. There's a million ways to lose this in paperwork. So LaSalle and Bureau County borrowed cars. And so almost everybody's Midwestern Railroad, if they know about the legend, may have a couple of LaSalle and Bureau County cars living on it. Ron Kofer's Lake Erie and Southern, I've helped him with a couple of them. I know. So. There's more to that story, but I don't know all of it. So.
And for all the viewers out there, one of the things you could do if you are modeling the early 1900s is using our special we got going on with 3D printed animals. You could have horses 3D printed.
Yeah, there are literally the 3D printing market is. I tell people it's revolutionizing model railroading because when we would have to hope and pray that Pricer had done a run of something and it was still in stock at Walthers, or God forbid, a Grant Line part we really want hasn't been produced in so long because the dies are shot. People have started to adapt to that and they're finding different kinds of things out there. And like I say, the farm toy guys, not all the 1/64 stuff scales down nicely, but a lot of it still does. You have to kind of pick and choose.
That is correct.
Well, like I wanted to say, thank you all for doing this. It's fun to be able to share some knowledge and get to meet a lot of really neat people virtually.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, I'm going to go look at that too. So.
I'm always hoping.
Oh, well, you never know. Someone might be around the corner if you are put in where do you live. Now, we've got to do a bit of a changeover here, haven't we, Gordy?
Yeah, I think you might be muted there, Martin, as well.
Yeah, I know. I just realised that then and hit the unmute button. So they saw the wheel and they've read the question. So
it's where do you live? And I'm always hoping that someone's going to say Orkney, but they never seem to. But, okay, so we're gonna disappear and go and do a reboot. And we'll be back with another stream shortly. So this normally takes us kind of 3 or 4 minutes to do this. And if you're watching this in the NMRA group, we need to reshare and stuff. So if you just bear with us, that'd be great.
And I'll be going to bed after this, so I'm going to reboot the system here. And being as it's now 2 o'clock Sunday morning, I'm going to try and get a couple of hours kip, and then wake up in the morning and scare Gordy and Speed when I come back in the room. So we'll hit the end stream now, and we'll be back in 4 or 5 minutes.